This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on reduction of price of LPG cylinder by the government. The participants are Subhamoy Bhattacharjee, economic analyst, and Nishit Kumar, anchor.
The high prices of LPG in recent times was a hot topic debated over the past few months. Now the central government has provided the much needed succor by slashing the LPG prices by a flat ₹200 across the board. Now to discuss its implications, we have with us Mr. Subhamoy Bhattacharjee, economic analyst. Mr. Bhattacharjee, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Mr. Bhattacharjee, how do you see this ₹200 reduction in LPG prices by the government?
Well, it's rather significant. First of all, looking back as to what has been happening in the range of oil and gas that we import, LPG is a particular type which is rather a more costlier one compared to, say, petrol and diesel. And yet, because of the need that it's basically catering to domestic consumption, pricing of LPG has always been a difficult thing to ensure compared to its price at which it is actually
procured,
available, in which it was being procured in India. That is where the problem, as you rightly said, and so therefore the reduction in the price of LPG is, basically it's a domestic consumer, retail consumer, so yes, it will be welcomed all over.
So as I said, that the LPG pricing has always been a very complex issue. Now, coming to the production and the import of LPG, are we self-sufficient or are we kind of importing almost all of LPG from abroad?
We essentially import almost the entire thing from abroad. In fact, LPG we don't, from our gas fields and others, it doesn't come in. I won't go into why it doesn't and all that. Point is that we don't have in our
natural resources.
LPG doesn't figure.
All right.
So that's fair enough. That happens for lots of countries. Problem that comes along is that LPG, so therefore if we take a look at whether we will be Atmanirbhar in LPG, which is a very good question to ask, the problem that is being looked at by the government is that who needs LPG? So when we look at LPG, what you notice is that this is essentially coming as cylinders, whereas what the government has rightly been doing is that it's been saying that as India urbanizes, then the amount of, or rather the areas where they would be needing LPG should come down, and instead it should be replaced by what is called the piped natural gas.
Okay.
Or for commercial vehicles, compressed natural gas, which is basically, we won't go into the difference, but the point is that's from natural gas, and that's not only do we produce quite a bit of it, but its prices are more softer and we can handle those better. Now, how does that happen? Well, the way it's happened is that the country in any urban area, it's very easy to send piped natural gas. And because of the density of people living in any area, this is a very easy stuff to do, and that is what the government has been doing. In fact, by 2021, when the final round of auction of compressed natural gas and piped natural gas occurred, what the government found was that it had actually been able to cover about 82% of India's geographical area. Now that's a very substantial thing, which means that about 82% of India's land mass will be covered by supply of piped natural gas for homes and compressed natural gas for consumption production. What would that mean? That would mean that the entire country's most of its requirement for cooking would be supplied by PNG. Okay. So what does that mean for the LPG sector? Well, that means that the LPG is essentially then required only for a very, what I should call a limited area, which is basically either semi-urban or rural areas, which is therefore much more easy, and I should say this is the challenge becomes much more possible to handle. And that is how the government is looking at the LPG scenario going ahead.
How does this slash in the prices going to help in taming inflation, especially the retail inflation based on consumer price index? It has surged to almost 7.4%, of course, mostly on account of food products and food prices.
Obviously, fuel is a very major part of consumer price inflation. So fuel does play a very strong role, plus also the fact that practically all the food that food itself is about 51% of the total consumer price inflation. And of that food, a large percentage is packaged food. It's not just people using fuel for their own consumption at home, but also for what they buy as packaged food, because almost all of that is essentially also going through the cooking process, and that also puts in some amount of the cost. So there is a very strong impact, or what should you say, process of cumulative price rise, which happens because of when the price of cooking gas rises. So therefore, cutting down the price of LPG, the government has done by rupees 200 per cylinder, as we say, is a very significant step, because it actually makes a very distinctly, it's almost 40% cut in the price per bottle. So that's a significant price cut.
Mr. Bhattacharya, there is also an announcement of providing additional 75 lakh connections under the PM Ujjwala Yojana, that is PMUI, of course in addition to the already existing connections. So how far-reaching relief do you see this move bringing to the masses, especially the rural people?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So let's look at the numbers. The Petroleum and Natural Gas Ministry says that the Ujjwala scheme has covered about 9.59 crore beneficiaries since it was launched in 2016. And most of this, about 34% is in Eastern India, 30% in Northern India, Western region is 21%, and Southern region about 10%. Northeast is about less than 6%. Now, this LPG scheme, which is essentially the nub of the Ujjwala scheme, is what does it mean? It meant that this, out of the total buyers of LPG, almost a third, in fact more than a third, are covered under the Ujjwala scheme. What does that mean? That the government is essentially subsidizing not only the initial connection, but also the subsequent provision of cylinders. How has it worked out? Well, it's worked out like this, that initially the government, when it started to expand supply of LPG into the depths of India, one of the first things that it found was that there wasn't too much space available. What does that mean? That means that since we import LPG, making more consumers of people those who are in the poverty line, below poverty line area come in would mean that sort of raising the import of LPG. But that was obviously going to be a very costly exercise. So the government actually did something like an out-of-box solution. So what it said was that we will not raise the LPG import so much as encourage people who have extra cylinders or rather non-using LPG connections to give those up. And surprisingly, that proved to be a very significant success. More than 1 crore connections were surrendered. So that created a headroom for the government to provide to people, those who needed it. Because these people the new consumers who came in needed it on two accounts, the subsidy. One was even to apply for the original connection, and second was on the refill. Now, while the connections, therefore, as we have said, it's gone up to about 9.59 crore beneficiaries, the big challenge has always remained that how to ensure that the cylinders reach the poor or those kind of areas. As you know, in a city, it's easy for the oil companies, basically IOC, BPCL and HPCL, to set up huge stores and service a large number of people from those stores. In the semi-rural or in the rural areas, you can't have such large stores. So there they have to actually create supply chains by using innovative things like bullock carts, camel carts.
So as per data, PM Ujjwala beneficiaries would, of course, as rightly said, that it's almost like 9.5 to 9.6 crore now. It would increase to 10.35 crores now, connections under the Ujjwala scheme. This is indeed a very welcome step by the present government, especially when we see the mitigation of health issues, especially of women folk, by having access to cleaner fuel. How do you see this?
Very significant, because if you look at it, of the total connections of LPG, and LPG is also used somewhat commercially, the data for March 2023, which is the latest figure, shows that there are about 31.4 crore active LPG customers in the domestic category, which means essentially that these are households. And when we say households, it's obvious, it's a no-brainer that most of it is essentially being handled because of the typical way household workers work on. Women do most of the cooking load. I'm not saying that's the right thing, but that is the way it is. Now, given that sort of a thing, whether she has access to LPG or whether she doesn't have access to LPG is a significant thing in determining how our health outcomes work on. And especially among the poorer people, these are the people coming under the PM Ujjwala scheme. These people, for them, the cost is not only for the first cylinder, first connection, which has been subsidized, but also the cost of the refills. And those refill costs, as you pointed out, now when that goes up, then what happens is the house tends to compromise. So they start using cow dung, firewood or coal more and more instead of using the cylinders. In a typical kitchen, you can imagine the effect of that smoke on the lungs and the eyes of these women. The health outcomes is obviously significant. And this has been pointed out by so many studies that Ujjwala has actually been a very major in which women's health outcomes have been improved in villages after villages across India, and that has been a substantial thing. So the rapid trend, reducing the price of LPG substantially keeps the good work going, and while it raises the government's fiscal pressure, it does substantially, the benefit is that the health outcomes become beneficial, and so therefore there's definitely a trade-off.
Indeed, the Ujjwala Yojana has been a game changer of sorts. Now, moving on to the next question, has this rupees 200 cut in prices been brought across the board, that is domestic as well as commercial connections?
The government notification says it's for all LPG. I would suspect that what will happen is for commercial, the government would sort of have a carve out saying it's not for entirely for the commercial thing, but that is something that they will be looking at. But for domestic, yes. The big point was whether it was not about domestic and commercial. The issue was that whether the LPG price cut would be for everybody or only be restricted to Ujjwala consumers. So that has been clarified that, basically that it's go for every sort of category of consumers.
Consumers have been getting subsidies as well for their LPG connections even earlier. Now, would they continue to get the same even now? And also the effect and the burden on the exchequer that it would entail?
Yes, the exchequer is, as I said, there's going to be an impact. It basically means that you now would be spending, or the central government would be spending about 6.5 for the subsidy. And for the entire year, that would be about 12,000 crore. So definitely that is an impact on the government finances. But as I said, buttressing that, or rather counterbalancing that, is the fact that the health outcomes, if those could be measured, would show good effect, and so the government would be able to recoup some of the cost by the lower spending on health, especially on bronchial diseases and stuff.
This rate cut is indeed in line and consonance with many other schemes for women empowerment and their upliftment. This is indeed heartening. How do you see this? Very briefly, Mr. Bhattacharya.
It is something that will have critics and others, no doubt about it, because there are issues there about who's going to be paying for it, whether there's going to be leakages, also the fact that to what extent could this have been counterbalanced by other things. Those issues would always be there. More or less keeping the LPG prices low. So there's also the issue that environmental questions do come up. But I would say that on almost all of these, especially even the environmental issues, I would say an LPG is a better idea than burning forests. So definitely it makes sense to push higher usage of LPG. In fact, if this means that many of the people who were not using LPG earlier, or rather had abandoned it halfway after not using it after the first cylinder, if they get to pick it up again, that will be wonderful news.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Bhattacharya, for having joined in and shared your wealth of information on the issue, on the topic. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
You were listening to a discussion on reduction of price of LPG cylinder by the government. The participants were Subhamay Bhattacharya, economic analyst, and Nishit Kumar, anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsvtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.